This meeting is being recorded. Yeah, you can
Yeah,
start.
Madhurima, I can mute us all.
Okay.
Yeah. Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone here from Talking Films Online, TFO for short. TFO was founded almost on a whim by Professor Nikhila and myself in June 2020 during the lockdown. Since then, TFO has had uninterrupted discussions on films from all over the world every Saturday at 9 p.m. on Zoom. It is a group of film scholars, researchers, students, teachers, and anyone passionate about cinema. It has been our practice to invite people to select and lead the discussion of the chosen film, which we watch in our own time and place. On some occasions, filmmakers, editors, and cinematographers have also joined our sessions. Aparna Sen, Amol Palekar, Girish Kasarvalli, and Adur Gopalakrishnan, to name a few. We have held film festivals such as East European, Iranian, women's cinema, and others. In the month of June each year, to celebrate our anniversary, we hold a smartphone short film making contest for students and a lecture series in various university departments. This evening, we will discuss 4 of Deepa Dhanraj's short films. Deepa is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and one of the founding members of Yugantar. Yugantar is a feminist film collective and has made a series of films in the early 1980s documenting rural and urban women's movements for labor rights and autonomy. The Yugantar films were recently restored by the Arsenal Institute of Film and Video Art and screened at the Berlinale in 2019. Focused on feminist politics, Deepa's extensive filmography spans 3 decades and subjects including population control programs in India, Muslim women's courts, community efforts to combat HIV/AIDS, and more. She has a special interest in education and has worked closely with government schools to create pedagogy suited for problems faced by first-generation learners who come from Dalit and Adivasi communities. Deepa is also a founding member of the Oral History Association of India. She has co-authored the book Rupture, Loss, and Living, Minority Women Speak About Post-Conflict Life with K. Lalita, published by Orient Black Swan. The discussion on the films this evening will be initiated by Professor Deeptha Achar. Deeptha Achar is a professor at the Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, Gujarat. She has co-edited Towards New Art History, Studies in Indian Art, Discourse, Democracy and Difference, Perspectives on Community, Politics and Culture, and Articulating Resistance, Art and Activism. She has coordinated and written 4 textbooks on academic writing brought out by the University Granth Nirman Board and Orient Black Swan. Her research interests include visual culture studies and childhood studies. Thanks to Deepa Dhanraj for agreeing to come on this session. And thank you, Deepta, for agreeing to initiate the discussion on these films. Welcome to both of you, and over to you, Deepta.
Thank you, Geeta, and thank you, Geeta and Nikhila, for thinking of me as a person who could initiate the discussion on these 4 remarkable films. But also thank you for the persistence and labor with which you all have kept Talking Films Online going without a break, literally, uh, and also trying to kind of imagine ways of making institutions and groups outside existing the existing frameworks that we live in. And it's not easy, and it requires a great deal of persistence to do so. And to have done it over 4 years without a break is like an amazing thing. So thank you for that this kind of cultural labor as well. So to plunge writing, these are four films made between 81 and 83, and in Molkarin, Tobacco Embers, Sudesha, and Is This Just a Story? And all these films look at questions of women and labor, women in relation to a collective, and the spaces that women occupy. It we have it's like almost imperative to look at these films as a part of what the autonomous women's movement was doing at that time. So this was when the autonomous women's movement was had kind of consolidated itself. Uh, it's with the women's movement starting roughly in the middle of the 1970s, but by the early 80s, the energy and the directions were of the women's movement were kind of getting consolidated. And one of the things that confronted the Indian women's movement at that time, if I'm not wrong, was to try and find a way of thinking about and representing women in a kind of non-victim position. And one of uh, uh, the tasks that feminists all across the board kind of set for themselves was to kind of either find images or create images of women that more closely resonated with the lived realities of their life, to kind of find out or make these new images where women are not either an aspect of nature, or to find images where women are not simply equated to gods, but women making their way through life as we see it around them. It was also the time when there were powerful moves and attempts to look at women's role in history, to find moments where women uh, played a role in history, uh, uh, made their presence felt, and uh, uh, change direction of the way things had always been done. It's interesting, for example, that Yugantar collaborated with two important members of Sri Shakti Sangatna in Is This Just a Story? Because Sri Shakti Sangatna around that time were also in the process of documenting, for example, the Telangana movement, the role that women played in the Telangana women's movement. So uh, there is a sense in which uh, different uh, groups of women were trying to find different directions, different ways of articulating, um, uh, different ways of working out maybe the representations of women. So you have, uh, and this actually took, if I took kind of two different directions. On one hand, there was a kind of attempt to work against the invisibility that constantly marked women's absence in disciplinary history. And one aspect of these uh, cultural projects was uh, to make present or make visible women in history. So, and another aspect of this kind of representation was also to kind of to look at uh, women as makers of history. So, on one hand, it was a search for agency, and on the other hand, it was a search for visibility. So, these two things together came together, and as a project to set oneself, it was not actually an easy thing because there were no models or examples with which to pursue visibility or agency in and through representation. So, in a variety of media, whether in film or in literature, uh, this was precisely the time that Suzy Taru and Lalita were compiling texts for women writing in India. The 80s was also the time that people like Nalini Malani and Nilima Sheikh were working out a feminist idiom with which uh, uh, to forge um, modern Indian art representations of women. So it can be useful to actually see these four films as circulating in uh, uh, a space where many cultural projects were taking shape, each of them in important ways feeding into one another. Yeah. So I think so. I'm going to make a bunch of points. Some of them are related to one another, some of them are not. But I would like to start by saying that it these films historically 40 years old now, so films should be could usefully be seen as participating in a larger cultural feminist project around representation, visibility, and agency. But the specific problem, I think, that maybe Deepa and the others of Yugantar perhaps faced was how does one try and build a filmic narrative? Because, as I said, there were no existing no simple models uh, or ideals to draw upon. So it seems as if they needed to kind of invent modes of representation in film as an through a process of kind of existing strategies that were available in film but also in the visual art, and also with the new uh, impetus, new uh, arguments that were made in feminist thought. So the process of marrying these two together was, I think, allowed something to emerge, which had not emerged, I think, in a consistent way prior. One of the most important strategies, I think, if across these films, except perhaps is this just a story, and you can see it in Molkarin and Tobacco Embers most specifically, is the way that real events mm, and the enacted events flow into each other seamlessly and stitched together almost by a voiceover, which which oftentimes uh, acts as a kind of memory of what had happened. But at the same time, that memory is taken into the future, into the present, into present discussions of what a future can be like. So, this particular strategy is, I think, literally put together in these films. Um, a memory, a staging, a present, and an envisioned future. Um, um, and uh, the other striking thing that I would like to point out, and it's obvious, but nevertheless, I would like to underline, is that these are stories about women, told by women, both uh, as the director is a woman, the women are talking about women, but also these are women, these are stories that women want to tell about themselves. And I think it's underlined in Tobacco Embers because the Women's Union collaborated in the documentary itself, in the making of the documentary as well. So you can see that the stories are not are kind of in the making, sure, but they are stories that women want to tell about themselves to themselves. So I think that is almost an organizing principle in all these stories. Um, uh, since the impetus at that point was to find r- images of real women, women whose lives resonated with our own, there there's a certain emphasis and urgent need to kind of document what is happening, what could otherwise be ephemeral. Um, there is an emphasis on realism as a visual language and the links between realism as a strategy and history writing has been underlined many times. Also, the writing of novels and so on. So, the idea of realism uh, is as a strategy is very crucial in all these films. And one of the, but there are kinds and kinds of realism, right? So I felt that there's a kind of a new kind of realism, if could I say that, and realism which actually draws quite substantially on portraiture. And in this, the kind of many of the shots are so painterly. They draw on existing traditions of portraiture which come from the West, essentially, Renaissance onwards. And the emphasis on portraiture is quite curious because many of the stories are about collectives. So, this focusing on an individual woman's face, uh, what does it mean to a narrative? And this is a question, really, not to a narrative which is about many women together. Um, so, in fact, that so the individualized, so these films somewhere struggle between a process of individualization and an attempt to show the collective as well. So the question is how to pull the individual woman and women as a collective together in a single visual narrative. How does one do that? And these films kind of uh, have in their strategies tried to mm, uh, solve this conundrum as it were. And I would also point out that uh, this is also um since the same kind of struggles and attempts were being made across a variety of mediums at the same time. There there were also attempts to write about women as collectives and to, for example, We Were Making History is one such attempt of writing women in a collective. But the problems that a visual narrative uh, holds vis-a-vis a verbal narrative is that the verbal narrative is linear, and so the story unfolds in a different way. Whereas in the visual narrative, you see everything at a go, even though the film is linear in that sense. But even so, to look at the individual and the collective together, how do you tell this story together? And how do you show this together? I think that is something which has been done mm, uh, partly through editing, partly through cinematography, and partly through drawing on rather old strategies of showing the face and the body. Um, and it also, these films also try to engage with the question of how can a group of women be represented without a loss of individuality? So, how do you do that? And splicing diverse shots, close up, conversations, angles, the stunning shots in tobacco embers of women sleeping. I think just utterly moving. So those were like uh, the way that section has been filmed is was very striking for me. In the context of portraiture, how am I doing for time? In the context of portraiture, I would also like to point out the tenderness with which women's faces have been rendered. The camera lingers gently on women's faces, um, showing how careworn and tired they are, but also showing pleasure, showing the way they eat food, the way they have chai. There's this the play of light offers a certain magic to their faces. Um, Today, embodiment is and thinking about the body in specific ways is like almost a given. And the kind of embodiment of women that we find in these films, um, all these films, I mean, are body. You find bodies where all these films show women in which the body is centered as a laboring body. It's a body which is able, which is skilled, which, but one aspect of this portraiture is a body in which sexuality, um, except perhaps in isn't just a story, sexuality is somewhere recedes, and instead what emerges is body and labor. Uh, I, but thinking of the context where the conventional context was to represent a sexualized woman's body, this the idea of a beautiful laboring body, to film it in such a way uh, is a radical move. Yeah. So, um, and then we, how am I doing for time? I have like,
Don't worry about time, Deepta.
okay, I've got about 3 or 4 points and then I stop.
Sure, sure.
So, the other question that kind of interested me was, um, how do these films represent men? And it's quite interesting because uh, in uh, in many of these films, in two of these films at least, especially in Tobacco Embers, somewhat in Sudesha and Molkarin, you have the presence of men who take a lead role in shaping these collective struggles of women. But how does the camera show them? They are almost always decentered. Very rarely you find the men in the center of the frame. They are always kind of at an angle, and they are always shown talking to women, not lecturing at them per se. And you have women who are discussing stuff, making strategies, uh, growing the ideas that are offered by men who have been in unions and in labor struggles for a while. So, one effect of this is that the collective struggles themselves don't seem to be simply led by men, but as something in the making, something born of women and shaped by women, but drawing on progressive movements elsewhere as well. So uh, in that way, it's also kind of comment on allyship. Uh, how can one imagine being allies? So, and also works against conventional understandings, at least at that point, of men being the enemy of feminism and so on. So, uh, you another strategy that these films use is that men, especially in Sudesha, for example, they talk of Gandhian activists, but that's just a mention. The filmic narrative just elides the role of men in that movement. And otherwise, men are also presented as an obstacle, as commentators, supporters. But uh, these men, the husbands, and so on, they are, it's always reported. They are never present there telling women. It's women reporting what their negotiations with men. Um, uh, um, uh, and in this context, I'd like to go to the four union leaders that have a small bit almost towards the end of Molkarin. And it, I thought that was so interesting because all of them were asked, for example, how do you see this struggle going forward? And they give uh, various accounts how there can be built a common feminist agenda and so on and so forth. And but when the camera comes back to the women are talking about quite different things. The way they see the future is very different from these middle class, educated union women. But the camera doesn't comment, it merely shows us this discrepancy and it moves on. Uh, and The last thing that I would like to kind of say is about the voiceover, particularly in Sudesha, um, and to some extent in Molkarin and Tobacco Embers. I feel that the voice overs, though they articulate what the women said, the it's too the voices are too educated, come from a particular um uh, from where the roughness and edges and energy of uh, the women in the collectives there does not quite come through, and it softens that energy. It blunts it to some extent, um, and it made me think about how this all these films are also exercises in translation, not only translation from Telugu to English, the subtitles, but also translating experience into a filmic medium. So, yeah, I'll stop there, and I have a question for Deepa, and that is uh, today, would you make films like these? Or would you have made these films differently?
Yeah, thank you, Talking Films, for organizing this and watching the films also. Thank you for that. And thank you, Deepta. You've done, my gosh, really, I admire the work you put into watching and thinking about the films. It's very insightful for me to listen to it. But before I answer your question, I think I have to share something about the context of how we made them and why we made them. So you get some sense of the background. So to begin with, we There was a time actually when, for example, if you look at the members of Yugantar, like if you look at, there was Abha Bhaiya, who later went on to become the founder member of two really important feminist groups, Saheli and Jagori. Then there was myself, who was, and basically I had a very limited film training, being an assistant to feature film directors, which is not uh, the way you should learn about cinema for sure. There was Meera, who was basically a writer and wanted to be part of it. And the only person who was, if you like, completely educated in film and skilled was Navroz, the cinematographer, because he had trained not only in MS Baroda, he had done photography and painting, but also he had been to the Film Institute in Pune. So this is the background. Now, if you look at what, for many of us, at least for Abha and myself, I think for us, post emergency, and then once the women's movement, what we call now the autonomous women movement, was taking off. And I think at that point, we were meeting often, and there was a very important meeting in Bombay, which I want to mention. It was the first meeting that was organized by Forum. At that time it was called Forum Against Rape, but it was. And it was a meeting organized in Bombay, and for the first time at a national level, you had, uh, whether they were feminist groups, fledgling groups, student organizers, there were also academics, there were also writers, cultural people. And I think it was at this meeting, and don't forget, it was the euphoria of the ending of emergency. And for all of us, that was a really very, um, how shall I put it, very exciting time, because everywhere you saw, for example, there were street theater was very big. It was being used to protest, anti-dowry things were happening. There was street theater, there was a lot of songs, there were a lot of little publications, poster groups. So in that ferment, I would like to say, there's a kind of artistic and activists both together ferment. So when we attended this meeting in Bombay, I think that's where this idea was born, because there were two women who came from Pune and spoke about the Molkarin Sangatna and what had happened. It was very fresh. I think it was just about 8 months old. And at that point, I think Abha and I felt, why don't we? It was so exciting, this idea that, first of all, that it was a spontaneous strike. It was not organized by any uh, trade union people. It was a spontaneous strike, and the women went about looking for support and help, rather than uh, being mobilized, which would have been the traditional, if you like, industrialized trade union mode. So we were very excited because, first of all, if you look at the informal sector where most women work, official trade unions are not interested in organizing women. It is too hard, too difficult. They're not in one place to begin with. Domestic workers, particularly, it's not like in one factory you can mobilize, etc. So at that time, we had actually, it started as a very simple idea that, can we, because it was exciting to hear what they had done. And what was very exciting also was how suddenly the idea of reproductive labor, household work, was something that they were raising. It was not the employers, but they were raising, okay? In the sense of how their labor freed up their employers to join the market forces, etc. By many things in this kind of way. The value of housework, the value of domestic work, many such questions. And this theorization coming from domestic workers, we found very exciting, really exciting. Also on caste, because most of the women were Dalit women. So then it was a very modest idea that, can we film the story of this union, really? And then can we exhibit this in other places as maybe a way to start a conversation, maybe an inspirational piece. Would that be possible? So this was a very, as I said, this is how we began. And because we wanted it to be, because we called it a feminist film collective, it wasn't just in the content of what we were making, okay? But could we establish a feminist practice methodology of work ourselves, okay? And this, I think, this is a very crucial part of the Yugantar experiment, totally for all the four films, actually. In that, could there be a way in which we, that is our collective, could work with other collectives? And could there be, I won't call it collaboration, could it really be a co-author process? And this was very tough because we had to figure out what this process would be, right? And because in one sense, as you know, and we were working on 16 film, now you make films on cell phones, and it's a whole different thing. But in those days, even understanding how a 16 camera worked, or how you would record sound was so difficult, for example, to translate that idea of that technology. Now it's easier. I mean, you can share cell phones, and I think people have a very different visual literacy of themselves because they're shooting themselves all the time, and they know, they have an understanding of how that looks or sounds or whatever it is, or how they want to represent themselves, whether it's a selfie or a video or whatever. So there was that challenge in the sense of that what we were filming would be very hard to communicate in the terms of image, right? We ourselves couldn't see it till it was processed in the lab and came back like 2 weeks later. So that was one issue. But the main thing was, could we sit together and have a conversation about how they wanted their story to be told? And I think this is what has guided all the films, actually. So in this context, many conversations were had, and many things which they felt were very important to tell the union story. We for example, in Molkarin, right away, we had missed the beginning. We had missed the when they walked off work, and the first strike and those first conversations. And in sort of documentary mode, if you were going to do it, very orthodox verite style, you would hear someone maybe speak about it, or something like that, and then you would stay in present tense in terms of image making. So, but when we spoke to them, they said, no, 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 that वो picture में जरूरी है, वो रखना ही है. You cannot. That is where it all began. So then this idea of, okay, then we recreate, then we do reenactments, and what we did is the same women who were part of the protest, the woman who was laid off work, and Padma, who started collecting women in the street. So they acted as themselves, okay, in the reenactment. But the kind of I find it not amusing, but it is a bit it is a bit ironic that we didn't shoot it as a dramatic reenactment. We shot it as a documentary, in verite style, and that is um, so. Just to say that I think at that time, all of us were, we didn't carry. See, first of all, except for Navroz, none of us went to film school, so we weren't burdened with this whole aesthetic, form, or invested in. So it was okay. We have to do this. I mean, why not? These decisions were taken like that. Okay, let's do it. It's not a big deal, right? Today, now I think people would be much more cautious, and very, because they're all. Uh, there's a way in which film education and watching films and what you aspire to be as a filmmaker, there are these modes, which people would adhere to. They may or may not, but I'd say they would be more, more careful that way. but frankly, we didn't care. I mean, I have to tell you, we just, you know, so you have reenactments. For example, in this film, you have reenactments in Sudesha. In all the films, you have reenactments actually, which we started doing. But apart from the consultative process, now the other thing is that I think in Molkarin, it was our first film. We were learning on the job really, and one thing that we had to also deal with was gatekeepers, right? How do you actually find a way to speak to women? How do you find a way to have those conversations? And if you have to go through gatekeepers, in a sense, so a lot of time goes in that kind of which is okay in one sense, because why should anybody trust you? Why should anybody um, be willing to be part of such a project? But so in the second film, for example, we decided on a different approach, that we would just go to Nipani. We would just stay there for 2 months, and we wouldn't shoot a thing. We'd just be with women, and so we took a room and we stayed in that area where most of the workers live, and they would come at night because they had no other time, so late at 9:30, 10 is when they'd land up, and then there would be these very free flowing kind of conversations. I wouldn't call them a typical thing which you do today, which is a sort of life story kind of interview, or or a very pointed thing, investigative kind of way in which you try to get at certain markers of how work goes. How do you define exploitation? It wasn't like that. These were very free flowing conversations, and there was a certain sense of camaraderie, even friendship. And eventually in that film, because we were so visibly identified with union women walking in the street, wherever, it's a small town, everybody knows, that no one gave us permission to get into a factory. That was very tough. So it was the women who did it. They convinced an owner, saying, you give us time. And he literally gave us less than an hour. And we had to get in and get out in 1 hour flat. And so that entire factory sequence about what we shoot was totally directed by them, because it was the first time we were seeing a factory, right? So you have to, this is how we do the tobacco thing, this is how we sleep after lunch, this is what we do, this is how we sabotage the machine, you know so in a sense, that whole bit, if you like, but after Molkaran, we had got into a mode where really they were scripting what would go into the film. And even the sequence of the night strike and the day strike, and this idea that this was that glorious moment, and they said there's no way this cannot be in the film, and we were completely daunted. I said, how are you going to get 5,000 women, 6,000 women to agree to come, and what kind of arrangements can we make, what about food, water, all of that? And I said, just leave it to us, just leave it to us, we will do it. And it was a it was amazing. I mean, just in the sense that even the way they organized it, which is in each village, they said, in each house, they said, you give two rotis. Everybody just give two rotis. And the way, even food was collected, even the way food was shared, or give rice. If you have rice, give rice. So just ek muthi, one fistful enough, So I've all these kind of experiences. I mean, um, and eventually, we also showed them the rough cut. We started doing that. There was a way in which they had to see the edit of the film, the rough cut. They had to approve. Um, and the sad thing, I mean, Deepta was talking about the voiceover. The sad thing is that in the original films, they all have the voice, original voice in original language, right, of the women. But we had also made dubs in three South Indian languages and Hindi, so that they could be circulated. Now, what happened with the passage of time, that the only film that survived the original soundtrack was in Marathi. In all the other films, we lost because of the material had just disintegrated. So That's why you have the dub. What you hear is that Hindi voice, which is really a dub. That's not the what the original was in. Yeah. So just to go back to that, now this is this. So in the Nipani film, in the Tobacco Embers film, I think it really worked in a sense of, first of all, there was, as I said, a relationship prior to filming, which was, pretty solid, and many conversations as to what they wanted, what they didn't want. And I would take notes when women spoke, and I would write down, certain things, the way they said it verbatim. So when the time came actually to write a narration or to write a commentary, I would remind them, you said this. Can we use this line? So it's not something that we wrote. I have to tell you that. It's not something that we wrote. But I picked out these lines from my notes and shared it with them. And then they would say, no, yeah, but maybe it sounds too dhila. Let's put emphasis here. Let's do this. Let's do that. And they would speak it, and only by speaking it they would then give suggestions as to rewriting, for example. So I think this idea of how do you develop a practice, a really a kind of feminist practice, was happening with each film. And also after the films we would attend screenings. And by this time, within the autonomous women's movement, we had enough contacts that people would ask for the films. So they were traveling a lot. I mean, the films were really, really traveling. Even in 16 Cannes, they were traveling. And often we would be present at screenings. And those were the really learning sessions as to, what were women making of these narratives, for example. Or, and to understand, okay, so sometimes something worked, sometimes it didn't work, or maybe there were omissions that we should have thought of. So it is a complete loop. You make it with a collective, their collective, our collective, in a process, and then it's released to other groups, other groups of women who are doing similar kind of work, for example, and it's returned in that way, right? So these films, for example, we never thought of them as, how do I put it, as films. It sounds silly, but in the sense of submitted to festivals, etc. It was never, that was not the idea at all. And so now I find it very astonishing, because once Arsenal has restored them, suddenly they're having a festival life. And I'm always bemused and shocked, like, what are these people seeing in these films now, for example, in Germany or wherever. I mean, but our thinking wasn't that. Our thinking was really, this is the loop that we want these films to travel in. And every screening, what we learned went into the next project. So, for example, in the Nipani film, and time with them, so many conversations were about domestic violence. So many conversations about domestic violence, about control, about being the problems of trying to lead to to be in public life, say as a union leader or not, what that meant at home, what kind of negotiations had to take place for women to be out politically. And so, because we were going with this method of always working with the women's group, we were not picking subjects which were just individual stories, which is why when we contacted Sri Shakti Sangatna, we said, can we, at that point, the initial idea was, to look at the shocking rate of dowry murders. Actually, it was just shocking, because the average age, if you went to the burns ward in the general hospital, was between 14 and 22, of women. And this was and Sri Shakti had done some work on this. And so initially we had, got into conversations, and slowly we felt, look, let's not get into a mode of, I mean, let's not talk about, of course, overt, explicit violence in that sense, but let us talk about the family as an institution. Let us look at family, So is this just a story? Is really, I would say, from our perspective as middle class women, okay, how do you look at family? And this the script was written literally jointly with all the members, and many of the ideas or the even dialogues and even situations that went in the film actually came up in conversations where women shared what had happened in, for example, in their homes or with their partners, their in-laws, etc. So again, it was the material was what do I call it? The material was excavated in a documentary style, but we realized that the way to present it would have to be fiction, because you can't, it's best if it's fiction. And as Deepta said, it's very much a home movie because you have the members of Sri Shakti acting in the film as well. Um, so yeah, so that is how the each, as I said, each film had its own process which built on previous work. And in this instance also, whether it was rough cuts, whether it was writing of dialogue, whether it was vetting of the script, and we filmed it in Rama Melkote's house, one part of her house. And of course, all the members were present for all the days of the filming, and many many of them would be some of them would come behind the camera and tell Navroz, can we look? And I think he entertained this for one day, and then he said, no, no more, now we have to work. So I can't have 15-20 people looking through the lens. But um yeah, but it was the I'll say one more thing, that um how did it work within our collective? Like, what was the role responsibilities of all the members, in a sense? So, if you see in the film, also in the credits, we don't put credits in terms of who did what. Okay, it's just all the names. And I have to admit that, except for Navroz, who, of course, did the cinematography, but all the other aspects, whether and we worked with an editor also, but um, so we would all discuss and sit together and decide, okay, not only how we would film, what it would, even whether it was framing or what kind of sequences. So it really was, I wouldn't say, I don't think anybody can be called a director in these films. So there was trying to work out a practice in our group in terms of how a different kind of filmmaking maybe, and working out a more political project in terms of how you can work together with other feminist collectives. And I think the overall goal, as I said, for us was that whatever was emerging in terms of whether it was labor, whether it was looking at family, which had a feminist perspective or frame, is what we want, was very important. That was what was very important. Like, how do you place even these movements, or, as I said, um, even how women theorize in the documentary ones. If you look at Sudesha, you look at all the films, and what we pick is really women being able to theorize their location, their relationship with I would say politics in the largest sense. It's not just in a narrow way. So if I think of what we wanted to showcase, in a sense, was this, right? Can we have these voices, but in this way? No, it's not just a simple narration of um, no, I mean, nobody's lives are simple. That's a wrong way to put it. But it's not necessarily just a life story kind of narratives. So, in that sense, that was very clear that they would never be individual stories. The thing, what happened with the Sudesha film, it became a portrait because by the time we got there, the Chipko movement was already over for many years, and women were scattered, and it really didn't exist as a movement. That time had passed, long gone. Um, and it's very difficult in the hills. Very difficult. I mean, to go to her house from the main road is a 3 hour hike up the hill. So this idea of even getting women together who were part of the movement from all over was proving to be very difficult, which is why that film is really a portrait film. But nowhere else. Yeah. Okay, I think I talked too much. So, and welcome questions or anything people want to ask.
Uh, Thanks, a big thanks to both of you. Thank you very much, Deepta, for initiating the discussion. You actually located the films within the context of its time in the 80s. And your focus on the visual language of the films also was something absolutely fascinating. And thank you, Deepa, for talking about how you actually went about the process of filming these documentaries, as well as the challenges that you faced in the process. Um, I mean, as far as my um, view on the views on the film, on all the films go is, I thought what was very important was the films, both individually and as a bunch of, or the four films collectively, they foreground women's labor at a time when, in the 80s, there were very large scale labor strikes and labor unions. But
Yeah.
all those were in the context of industrial labor, which willy-nilly became men's issues. So in that kind of a context, I thought, the way you brought out women's issues and broke that hierarchy of, men's issues being more important and more prominent in the public domain. That was something, y- you know, a major contribution to shaping the perspectives of people also towards women's labor and women's issues. And and it was also very interesting that for some reason you could not film Is This Just a Story as a documentary, as you said that it had to be fictionalized. I was just wondering whether it was the class issue that came in the way of, making it as a documentary. It was not about, in the sense that the story that you wrote for that film is like a microcosm of the lives of middle class women, because here you have the woman who has an office job, unlike the other films where the women are actually working class women. So I was just wondering whether that was your reason, that you could not, show them as a collective, and it had to be one story which was a stand-in for other for the collective of middle class women's stories. So these are some of the things that struck me while watching the film. If you would like to respond, Deepa.
Yeah, so firstly, yeah, I take your point about the no, it was very important for us actually to tell these
Deepa?
stories about. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
As I said, it was very important for us to tell the two union stories, mainly because those stories are always invisible. They're invisible, they're not reported, and somehow they do not have the same legitimacy in a sense of what is work. Number one, what is work? Okay, what is considered work? And I think that's why for us picking those two was very important, because they would not even be reported. I mean, there would be a small, like the Nipani strike, for example. It was huge because at that time, I mean, now that has come down. There were more than 80 factories in Nipani, okay, processing tobacco for BDs, for the BD industry. And when they went on strike, it's across Karnataka that the BD industry, which is in millions of rupees and crores, was affected. Hmm. And if they wanted a raise to 7 rupees 10 paisa per day, they only got 5, but they were earlier getting 3. That their victory of obtaining that amount affected workers across Karnataka, right? Despite all this, which I think is such a momentous victory and impact in the livelihoods of lakhs of people, it was never reported in that way, you know. Uh, so very much for us, I think this idea of work, so what they call informal labor, what they call informal economy, etc. Very, we were very keen that we have to pick these two stories for that, right? That's one part. Okay, the other thing, why did we decide to make it fiction? I think now, it's not to do about class. I think it's got to do about the way in fiction you can reveal. Actually, if you watch that film, there's very little dialogue, right? But this idea, the kind of microaggressions, like in a home, which women experience. Now, in a documentary, of course, we could do a documentary where you have, but then it would all be speech. It would be women relating um, you know, uh, what they've been through, for example, which is also moving. I'm not dissing that. I'm saying that's another way to do it. But we felt here because what emerged in these very emotional and moving conversations, which we were all part of, when talking about what we had been through as girls, as young women, as in relationships, in students, and being married, I mean, the issue of in-laws, etc. So, what came up, so many of the stories were about these kinds of ways of feeling diminished, feeling dismissed, not heard. And we felt that is really important and that you can do in fiction, And I have to tell you that this is our hit film, this one. Whenever it was screened, I remember it didn't matter which class of women were watching it. It would be just like a dam breaking. Everybody would start talking about what had happened to them, or a sister or somebody. It would just, there would be tears. It would be so there's some way I feel that the decision of keeping it in a fictional mode actually worked for what we wanted to portray, because in that film, it's a lot to do with her interior world, you know and that is something also that never women get a chance to think about, or talk about, or reflect about. No, it's not seen. And the other thing, at the time, I have to tell you, because that film was made like 1982, maybe, yeah, early 83, maybe 1982 actually, which was the radical idea of female friendship, you know and in the and even after the screenings, people would always bring that, women would bring that up, Acha, so she had somebody, she could speak, she could be heard, she had some. In Telugu, they say, not moral support, but they say pakka balam, which is a lovely word. I don't know how to translate it, but or whatever. But this, so the idea of female friendship, which is a very radical one, actually. When this friendship, which is not familial, not within the family, outside. right? So we were trying to do a lot of things here. It's also her own. I mean, when you talk about men, no, Deepta, that the person who acted as the husband, Purnachandra Rao, he was a very well-known theatre actor and a good friend, and he was most upset with us. He said, "What kind of cardboard character have you made this man into? Like, I mean, what is this nonsense? Like, he won't even pick up his crying child and all this. Such rubbish." He was so upset with his role. but but I think, that actually when I think of that film, and I kept wondering, like, why does it have that kind of impact on women? Okay. And I really feel that, when we would have conversations, when we drafting before the script, even these sharing of life stories and what we've been through. I think the anger and rage and grief of those conversations somehow energetically moved into the script. I can't think of any. I don't know how else to put it, because there's a way. It's so interesting. Recently, when I'm not, I mean, say a couple of years ago, after they were restored, we had a lot of screenings in places, and people always would tell me, "Oh, it's like Great Indian Kitchen. Have you watched Great Indian Kitchen?" I hadn't, by the way. I went and watched it after that. But this thing of, yeah, so I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that was what our thinking was at the time, and I think it worked in that way. Yeah.
I did, yeah. It's now open for discussion. Would anyone like to come in? Yes, Nikhila.
Yeah, so thanks, Deepa, for joining in. I know you have many important people who need your attention.
No, no, no.
Um, yeah, and Deepta, thanks for agreeing to do this very important discussion for Talking Films online. Actually, I have two comments to make. One is just briefly to talk about, how I came across. I requested Deepa to share Sudesha link with me because I was putting together a corpus of films on the Chipko movement. And so when I watched the films together, as you said, Deepa, all these films. The first film in my corpus, for instance, begins in 1981. So
Mm,
they all are very much after the movement, but the way in which they try to memorialize the movement by talking to the leaders and the so-called male leaders, of the
yeah,
movement,
yeah,
and they're all, voice of God, expository documentaries,
yeah,
when the women indeed, in the first couple of documentaries, when the women are in the frame, their voice is simply not heard. So in that milieu, where you have documentaries with this very set pattern of filming, I mean, Sudesha was like nothing,
mm,
nothing like any of these. And I was so surprised that, why I suppose it became so stark for me also because I was putting them all together to watch one after another, and then Sudesha was so different. And yes, like Deepta, I too noticed the reenactments, but there were also many interesting aspects. For instance, in like the way in which the camera goes right into the house and it's waiting there, and nothing more momentous than mother and daughter's drinking tea is happening there. So it's such a meditative, kind of a moment. So I was also very curious about that process of film because they are not obviously acting for the camera. In fact,
mm,
the camera is like, almost like a fly on the wall kind of a moment where, they have gone in, and then there is. So I was curious about how you captured these moments, how they were so oblivious of the camera, and how they were not really, conscious of enactment. So I wanted to ask you about that. The second aspect that really struck me about all these films. So when you made available the link and I saw these films, as you said in the beginning, there are many continuities, but there are also stark departures. I mean, it's a moment that is gone. It's a moment, in the past, of the past. So there are things that cannot happen today. The kinds of mobilizations, the kinds
Yeah.
of. So I felt that, it's important for us to see these films today, because at some level they almost seem mythological. So it's also something that I want to show, probably. I mean, it's like of a time, which cannot come back. It's like where you only say, okay, so did this actually happen?
Mm,
So I felt that when one talks about a feminist pedagogy, or makes use of these films for classroom discussions, I thought that these are films that really stand out for us to say, yes, such things actually happened. So
mm,
both in the manner of representation, which I find very novel.
mm.
So I'm wondering how conscious you were, how this was a theorized kind of a position that you took, in what way you want to represent your subjects, both in that, as well as in a kind of, as a kind of record of a history of a moment that is gone. I think they are invaluable today. Yeah. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, for saying that. So this is a good, actually, this is a good place for me to talk about what Deepta said about the camera work and portraiture and things. So, just to share that Navroz, as I said, his eye, his way of framing, his way of composing, because he had studied painting, okay, in Baroda, and he had also done photography, but so he had a very keen sense of, uh, uh, you know, a keen sense of composition, I would say, of framing. And he also had, which is very, very difficult to do, fantastic documentary cameraman reflexes, because there are no second takes. It happens once and then it's over, right? Um, so these two things together, I think, and you use the word tender. I've often said that, yeah, he has a very tender eye, a very affectionate eye, like the way he frames people, and it's also a very respectful eye. And um, I think for us, all that was very important when we talked about what visually, how are we going to, in all the films actually, how are we going to, um, you know, actually film women, like what are we going to do? And the idea in each case, except for Sudesha, and of course, Idi Katha Mathramena, is this just a story, is a fiction film, but at least the first two films, which are based on union stories and collectives, was that uh, basically, if you like, the heroine of the film is the union. It's they're individual, they're women in it, but basically it's all the women who are there, right? So you will see that we never do, for example, an interview of an individual woman. Never, right? They're always in a group. Within that group, sometimes if you move to one woman who is watching, I wouldn't say it's an individuation or individualization of, that's not in conflict with the collective, but she is still part of the collective, even materially, physically in that space and participating in that space. So this was very important. How do we film, how do we film the collective in that sense to retain that idea, right? Then the if you see in the Nipani film, the tobacco workers film, you know that at the end there are these three very long shots of women who are in a regular union meeting. That's how they do politics. It doesn't have to have an end, that we will do X, or we will end up doing Y, or whatever. But that's a regular meeting. That's how union meetings are. I mean, they argue, they yell over each other, they don't agree, you know, um, and it's quite cacophonic. And there was Navroz just trying to follow the energy of what is happening there in terms of who is speaking. And there is a way in which, as he is looking for the speaker with the camera, and in that following kind of mode, you get a sense of being there. Okay. And if you look at it carefully, they are very long shots which are cut, they're not edited down. They're just long, long takes as they are, which have been put together. And I remember the editor saying, "This is not how films are made. And this is very boring. And what is this? Nothing's happening here. And what happens at the end? They talk something, but it doesn't end up with anything." I said, "I don't care." And even at that time, I must say, I don't know where I got the, if you like, the cheekiness to tell a senior editor that, "No, no, it's fine. Just leave it like that. It's okay. Just leave it like that." Because the point is, and that's my favorite part of the film, which is that is what they'll continue to do. That is daily union politics. That is how it's going to be, and they'll continue to do that, right? And you see them, you see their laughter, you see the energy, you see the, and the humor. I mean, when she says, "Patane ka, how do we con women into participating?" I mean, they're doing a big scam. Everything is going on at the same time, right? So I feel that idea of how you film a group, really film the union as a collective, I think comes from that we took a conscious decision that there would never be individual women, always in a group, always where they were doing politics in the way they do politics, right? That is one thing. Now, to talk about Sudesha, now there we had a serious challenge, as I told you, because firstly, it was long gone. Secondly, it is impossible to get even five of the very active women members together because of the distances and where they lived. And you should really see the terrain. I mean, I have a photograph somewhere which I must find again, which is that of our equipment going up on a pony. Okay. And we're terrified that it'll fall into the river, or it'll fall into the gorge or something. And there's really narrow goat track. Does that kind of physically very, what's the word, daunting to just even reach her village. Okay. So we stayed in the village. Again, same method that before shooting, Abha and I stayed there. Abha stayed for much longer than I did. Um, and there was a way it's a small way, it's not a very large village. So, everybody knows you at some point. Um, and when we were there, I realized that, okay, Chipko movement, fine, that will be the framework of the film. But basically, just look at the way, the brilliant idea that they came up with is that it's not just environmental issues. In the hills, it's a question of you cannot survive without water, fuel, and fodder. You cannot live. Actually, you cannot live. It's so basic. It's absolutely a survival issue. It's not in the way it was framed later, as uh, in that kind of sort of ecofeminism business, the way it was framed. But and more as we lived there and saw what their lives were like you remember that sequence of the two young girls pounding rice, okay, paddy, to give us rice, just two cupfuls of rice. I couldn't eat that rice, frankly. I couldn't eat it. When I saw that, 45 minutes of that back-breaking labor just to get the two cupfuls of rice, right? So in that film, we decided, okay, let us just look at what it takes to survive here. You go walk all day downhill, through a river, uphill to get fodder, okay, for your animals, and you come back. I was so angry with that buffalo. He did it in 5 minutes, yeah. Like, I mean, a whole day's labor, and those leaves were gone in like 5-10 minutes, okay. So in that film, we really thought, okay, let's just foreground what does it mean to survive and live in this space, and what were they fighting for? When you look at that, then that's what they were fighting for, you know. So whether it's so in that sense, um it's a political film which is a very quiet film. It's a very quiet film. It's in the pace of their lives, how they live, and that's why that tea scene, for me, I love that scene because it's a daily life, you know, how it goes. And yeah, so that was the logic of that film. See, every film comes from the material reality of what we have to work with. So there is no one size fits all. There's no one aesthetic form that we're committed to, or you know, that we can't, that we have to replicate, or etc. So in each instance, the formal as aesthetic arises from the material at hand. Yeah.
Any other interventions, comments, questions? Yes, please go ahead. Fabienne, would you like to say something? Ajanta, Jayanto.
Did any of you feel they were dated? I don't know. Did you feel?
No, no. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
we
yes.
can, we can.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. It was, I was so interested. It was I was passionately listening to both of you. It's really, it's like and the four films are admirable, even aesthetically. I mean, some of the scenes are extremely
Mm,
beautiful. And I was wondering, the first film, I thought it was a fiction. I was very surprised. Yeah, it's obvious that the three other films are documentaries, but the first one, with this woman and her her relation with the husband, um, is it a documentary? She's playing her own roles, or is it an actress? I was wondering, and this is my first question. Second question, it's not a question. It's, yes, it's a kind of question. The man portrayed in the films, it's very interesting. The Deepa said in the first place, because you have the blinded man and the enlightened man, you know, like two separate kind of two two very caricatural. And I
mm,
think today, I think maybe today it would be less caricatural, but in the 80s, maybe the enlightened men were very few, which is not the case today, where a lot of men are awakened on women's rights and gender study, gender roles, etc. So I think it was very interesting. And I was also thinking if Dziga Vertov, you know, the Russian
Man with a moving
cinematographer,
camera. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, did he has an impact or influence at the theory of cinema and documentary? Because in France, we had in the 80s also le groupe Zita Vertov, a group of collective cinematographer
Mm-hmm.
who worked like you work. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they did everything together. All the names were at the end of the film, and there were no director, as you told us, which I think it's very exciting and very interesting. And this group, Dziga Vertov, made film like you did almost on Palestine.
Ah,
Uh,
okay. Mm.
on Palestine, and very interesting. And I was thinking, and they were called Zigavertov because they were very much influenced by the theory of Zigavertov.
Um, I'm confused, Fabian. Which film do you mean where she's an actress? Which film are you talking about?
The
Is
first
this just
one,
a is
uh,
this just a story?
Idi Katha Mathramena.
Yeah, yeah, that is fiction.
Lalita,
Yeah,
Fiction.
Lalita. It's a
yeah, that
fiction.
it's a fiction. But
Yeah,
the people who are the two women who are acting in the film were women who were part of this feminist group called Stree Shakti Sangatna, and they were part. They were also part of the process of developing the script, and they have
they
acted
were
in it.
not actresses. They were
No,
not
they weren't
actresses.
actresses. But aren't they
But
great?
they're incredible. They're great.
Great,
They're
really
really
great.
great.
Yeah,
Very great.
really
I
great.
said,
Yeah,
my God, huh?
yeah, they were really great. That's true. Yeah. So Ziga Vertov. So as I said, earlier, I never had a formal film education. So I think we were just making stuff up. Okay, that's to be honest. we were just making stuff up. Much later, of course, I read and I have watched The Man with the Movie Camera, and I know about Ziga Vertov, and but that was much later when I got seriously interested into documentary. But yeah, and this idea, I think there were many. Later when I started thinking about it, there were actually many collectives, even people who tried to do alternate film practices. I
Yeah,
discovered that they were, and 80s was the time. 80s all
yeah,
over. It was during the 80s, which is something very amazing. I mean, there were things happening in Peru, in Britain. I'm talking now about uh, women's film collectives, or sometimes self-identified as feminists, sometimes not. But all that was happening in the 80s. It's really a very rich time. Yeah.
Do you think it could happen now?
I don't know. Nothing to. It could. If I think it's a question of the intention. I don't think our initial intention was film. Our initial intention was something else. Film was the vehicle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But if our initial intention was how do we share these stories of women's battles, women's resistance everywhere, and we could have written articles, we could have done different things,
So
but
why did you
we
choose?
we chose to do film because I think and also to tell you, like in the 80s, if you look at film history, whatever, I mean, I think where were women's voices, working class women's voices in their own voice? I'm talking just about voice, literally, materially voice. It
Yes,
wasn't there. It just wasn't there. I mean, you look at even films division documentaries, they would be there as subjects, they would be filmed, but you wouldn't hear
Yes.
them. So for us, I think it was so exciting to actually the physical presence of women and voice was so exciting that couldn't be communicated any other way except through cinema. So that was
eh,
our logic, um, really, yeah, and I have to say that I think that excitement has stayed with me throughout my entire filmmaking career. I just I am so intrigued and fascinated and by voice, and particularly women's voices. Yeah,
yes, it was revolutionary during the 80s. It is
yeah,
true. Good
absolutely
memory.
revolutionary. Yeah,
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for.
Fabian, you spoke about Ziga Vertov, and I was reminded of another woman filmmaker, J. Geeta. She teaches at Newcastle University, and she has made a film called Woman with a Video Camera.
Oh,
Inspired by Man with a Movie Camera.
movie
She's made
camera.
a film.
Yeah.
Yeah, Woman with a Video Camera.
Okay.
Any other? Yes, Madhumita, please go ahead. You have
Um,
unmuted.
Hello, Deepa, Deepta.
Hi. You.
What a lovely conversation this has been. And I so regret not having heard this or not having watched this film before I wrote my thesis on feminist documentary filmmakers in India, Deepa being one of the biggest characters in that.
Yeah.
But
Well.
just to take you back to this aspect, actually, what you are calling making stuff is has been in many ways the pioneering of feminist documentary filmmaking in India, and one of the most fascinating
Madhu, I
things.
wouldn't dare to say that other people are
Okay,
making.
allow me to say it, Deepa. You can keep on denying
I
it.
wouldn't dare say that.
No, the
Yeah.
other thing that I would very much like to say is what we were discussing about the question of voice, how
Mm,
you always actually
yeah.
uh, made this voice represent a collective, and
Mhm.
how the camera work. Now, Rose's camera work became synchro went in sync with that. That is one of the most fascinating aspects of Deepa's films, I think. Not just these four, but it's continued in the later films where there
Mm-hmm.
is never a voiceover. The story is told from the perspective of women, and that in many ways becomes one of the foremost aspects of feminist documentary filmmaking. So, yes, these are such lovely films, and uh, great that Arsenal could
Yeah.
actually get these
And
back
yeah.
for
And
us.
Madhu, if I can interrupt you, I wanted to say it at the beginning, but I have to say this that the films would not have been available if it was not for the work of Nicole Wolf, who is she used to teach visual culture at Goldsmith. She's a researcher, writer, film scholar, and it was directly through her intervention with Arsenal Berlin that this got made. So I'm just so indebted to Nicole and Arsenal for
Mm.
having made this possible. Really, sorry I interrupted you. Yeah.
No, but just one small thing. This
Yeah.
is also as a question. Now, in documentary film practice, we talk so much about reflexivity, about turning the camera on to ourselves. Wouldn't you think Idi Katha Mathramena does a little bit of that? Um, bring it back to, okay, us, in the sense of not to be thinking of women like ourselves, you, for example, and bringing it back in the sense that it becomes a story which is not out in terms of being there in a workplace or being there in a collective, but how does an individual story, like you were speaking about interiority, so I was just thinking, would you also consider that as an important aspect of this film, which is of course about friendships, women's friendships, about creating collectives, but it also comes into our own lives in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a film where the class of the characters on camera and behind camera are similar. I would say
Hmm,
that for sure.
hmm,
That's a very different kind of, and even as I said, the way the script emerged was also that kind of process where all of us had to participate in that. Um, so it really emerged in that way. But self-reflexive, the way I understand it is where you formally, aesthetically, you're making visible that there is a fourth wall, that you are I mean, I don't know. That's the way I sort of understand it. That you are commenting in a personal voice. The filmmaker is in the film in a person with a personal voice, um, and yeah, that's how I would understand reflexive. But I would say, is this just a story? Is really about yeah. I would say it's more about a class question really than self-reflexive because we made it. I mean, it's very very what's the word? It's very structured as a fiction film. It's a construct, no? It's very structured as a fiction film.
Hmm.
Yeah.
No, I just meant thematically, just meant in terms of it evolving from
Experiences. Yeah.
feminist groups.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
then, yeah,
yeah.
thank you. Thanks a lot.
Any other comments, questions?
Must be really late there, right?
We are
The time.
used to, yeah,
Yeah.
it's 10:40, but that's fine
Okay.
with.
Geeta,
Okay.
Yes,
can I
yes,
come?
Jayanto. Yes, Jayanto, please
Yeah,
come in.
I have actually wonderful films, and I think the first film is totally different from the three other films which are intended, one being fiction, the other being pure documentaries. But I found that even in the within quotes protest films, uh, there are feminist issues, which I found very interesting because otherwise it would be only a labor movement thing,
Yeah.
But it is actually there. It is actually there that very deliberately the feminist issues have been put in what otherwise would have been merely films of protest. Secondly, um, in the film Sudesha, which I loved, I found uh, I was quite intrigued by the fact that, of course, no one even resembling Sundarlal Bahuguna is there in the film, but somebody could be. But the fact is that the protagonist, the main woman there, some she's making a statement which could be read as being critical to the Chipko movement. She says something like, "ये तुम्हारे चिपकने से कुछ नहीं होगा, चिपको से कुछ नहीं होगा," and they were the ones who actually made it all happen. So I
Mm.
mean, I find a little bit of irony there, which I'm quite intrigued. Also, let me share very briefly something very personal, autobiographical, if you have want to have it that way, that during the same time, between 73 and 76, I spent about, very large chunks of time in the Garhwal Hills. And two things that I noticed which quite fascinated me. And today there are questions now that from places like Chamoli and Uttarkashi and all that. I mean, particularly Uttarkashi, the Bhagirathi River flowing by, very, very, full of current and all that. And there would be, at one time, I mean, these things happened every once 4 or 5 days at that time. So there would be about 100 logs, flowing
Mm.
down the river because that was the most convenient way of
Yeah.
transporting them. And not only the fact that there was a faint idea of something wrong happening somewhere, at that time, it also we felt terribly excited by the ingenuity of man, which is very strange. So I think that this film, which pertains to that time, is very, very, let us say, to the point. And the second thing is that we create these myths and mystifications of warrior races and people who have to join the armed forces because they cannot think of doing something else. So one film, when she's talking about her husband, it was very, very, interesting to find out that the men, of course, this is tradition, but the men they want to join the army because simply there is nothing else for them to do, and also they like to drink, which is made easier in a job at the armed forces. So these things, which attach, which kind of juxtapose the monumental with the trivial, I found very, very interesting. And is it critical? This is my question of the Bahuna-led Chipko movement.
Thank you, Jayanto.
And thank you for pointing out the fact that, yes, they were always very feminist as well. It wasn't just, they weren't just worker stories. I think that, yeah, thank you for that observation. I'm glad that comes through strongly. Okay, about the Bahuguna comment and things, is see, in a way, both Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Bahuguna, I mean, they were taken up so quickly by international agencies, right? I mean, in a sense that the biggest irony I feel about the Chipko movement is it started as a movement for local people to actually safeguard and work as caretakers of forest resources. That they would take only what they needed, but they would protect the forests. But eventually, the law that was passed actually totally backfired and became a law where local people were not allowed to enter the forest at all. And this is something that really, in a way, if you look at the history of the time, it's also feminists in the north who took one part of the Chipko movement and validated it in the sense of here are these women protecting the environment. They were they were not just protecting, they were caretaking and using it so that they could also use those resources to live, but in a way which would not destroy the forest. That part, of course, disappeared. And I think Bahuguna and Chandi Prasad Bhatt went with this environmental perspective that forests had to be really, totally protected in the sense that even local communities could not access it. And that made people very bitter. That's the history of that, is what I want to say. Yeah, happened.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments,
Deepa,
observations? Yes, Fani Raj, please go ahead.
Deepa ji, coming back to your question, whether you feel it's dated now.
Tell me.
Yeah, number one, the way the collective consciousness grows can never get dated. I mean, your three films have got it so wonderfully, never get dated. And second question I want to ask you is not a question, it's an interesting thing. You said that you never worked on, I mean, at that time you didn't have an experience of filmmaking. And Nauroji went on with it. So
Yeah.
it's Nauroji. But looking today at those mission scenes, they are wonderful. They are wonderful in a sense that the way he positions the camera and way he moves the camera and the long shot, what you said of the meeting, that meeting is both males as well as women, and it's very interesting conversation which goes on. I mean, any left ideologists or theorists should see those visuals to see how you capture the making of the collective consciousness from experience, organic experience of the woman. I mean, it's very heartening to listen to you. It's a master class anyway, because listening to how that script was made, I mean, with those women, and that's what the Dalit women are trying to do now. I mean, they're going back, talking, and trying to give the camera to young girls, and they go and do it. So, I mean, it's wonderful that you started at that. It's being continued. Again, it never gets dated. That process never gets dated. And thanks for that. You initiated that process, and that process never gets dated. But now I'm interested to know that after the film, I mean, after final cut was arrived and looking at the frames and mission scenes, did you ask Nauroji that uh, can they be made as a grammar for next film, or can they be that or this? Because at that time you said that you didn't have any idea of that, and
Hmm.
later you thought that those kind of creating a grammar, because I was stunned by those visuals in the sense that how to capture those that
Hmm.
uh, making the collective consciousness, because uh, even in Jiga Vato's film, you don't get
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
Hmm.
this is the first time one can see the other film. I think it was made around same time. Anand Patwardhan's Kannada documentary about the farm woman. Uh,
Yeah.
if I look at that, this Navroji's frame is much better than that. So now going, we cannot
Hmm.
say dated, but we can now can create a grammar of feminist grammar of how do you use your camera to capture the process of formation of the collective. I mean, did that come to discussion post you created this film?
No, it was during actually, every time while shooting itself, right? Um, I would always try and educate myself, that you say a particular lens you're using, or you're looking through the frame and you're seeing what do you see, and how can you position it. And Navroz had a thing where he would always keep the camera at eye level, okay, not top angle, because then it looks like you're looking down on people, or very low angle, which makes them look very pompous, and but always at eye level. So I feel, see, there are a lot of things even technically that you can do in the way you shoot, which conveys dignity and respect, you know so this was one very key thing. And over the time, I also had to very quickly educate myself that, because only he is seeing what he's shooting, right? You can be standing next to him, but you don't know which part of the scene the camera is actually taking. So I had to educate myself on all those kinds of things as well. But Navroz was so brilliant. I mean, he understood at once. There was no need for conversation or anything. He was just absolutely brilliant, and in immediately picking up what was required. And so he was excellent at that. And I just wanted to tell you that you said something about, this can never be dated. When the films were restored, we had a screening actually in Karnataka, and we called members of BD Workers Union, Garment Workers Union, 3, 4 unions where a lot of women in the outskirts of the city, but domestic workers union, where they work, and we just showed them the Nipani film, and we said, "What do you think about it?" Because I wanted to dub them all into Kannada, the language of Karnataka, so that they could be used again. If anybody wanted to use them, we would make a new dub. And so I requested, yeah, please take a look and see if it's still relevant. Can is it worth it? And one of the people, he told me this beautiful thing. He said, "Madam, this is a old school union manual, how to make a union," is what he said. you know so that's what he called it. He said, "This is absolutely, you should do it, because this is how unions should be made. Even today we can use it and say, please watch, this is so I think what you said about that can never die is so true, really. And thank you for your comments, really. Yeah.
And we use this film because in Karnataka we are showing it to women's collective, and we are trying to show it to women collective.
Mm.
Can we this, this
Yeah, you
either?
can contact me for the Kannada versions, 100%.
Okay, you have Ganda, but
Yeah, I have. We actually, after that meeting, we created Kannada versions of all the films.
September we want to show it to a group of women. So
Hmm? Sorry?
in September we wanted to show it to a group of women. They,
September, is it? Okay. I'm not in Bangalore now. I'm with my daughter in the US. I'm only back October. After that, is it possible? Because I don't have that hard disk with me to share it with you.
can I use this Vimeo link at least to?
Now, this you can show, yeah, but it's not in Kannada, no?
No, it's all right. I mean,
If you
they
can
can.
you show it, yeah, yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
But later, if you contact me, I'll give you the Kannada set. You can keep it with you.
Yeah, because we need it. We are taking to
Yeah,
colleges and Mahila Mandir. We are
yeah, yeah.
thinking,
Surely, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Any other interventions? Any comments?
Yeah,
Yeah,
can I ask
Rajan.
a question? Uh, Something very, very striking was the dress, and the dress comes across, right? And Deepta made a comment about women's bodies, but the idea of women's dress in all the documentaries tells a story also. So I could you kindly comment about it?
Um, in what sense? Because they're wearing what they wear. This is
Yeah,
not.
that's exactly what the point is, that
Yeah.
they don't dress up for the camera, they don't do all these things,
No, no, no,
and
no.
that's the way they live their life, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
it's also documented, because I don't know whether anybody would dress all the dresses, especially the Dipani film, right? Yeah, I don't know whether anybody would dress like that anymore, or maybe there are a lot of people who dress like that, but not for films, right? Yeah.
No, no, in rural Maharashtra, they still wear this Goshti sari.
Yes.
The older women
Yeah.
still wear. But one thing, actually, if you look at it, and I was very struck actually when the films were restored, and I was looking at the footage, and the difference between then and now is if you look at the shot of the women walking from the village in the morning, how many of them are barefoot?
Yeah.
And today, I think you would not find people who are barefoot. They would all have some kind of chappal. Nobody is. I mean, it just struck actually when we were restoring. I was looking at the material again and again, and that really struck me. That this thing of footwear. How today, right? Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
yeah.
Okay. Nikhila and I actually have a way of judging how successful a session has been, and that is, how long it stretches, and the fact and the fact that it is 3 minutes short of 11 p.m. shows
Uh,
that this has been an excellent session for TFO. And we have Deepta and Deepa to thank, and also all those who raised questions and spoke about their impressions of the film. And so we end this session now. Thank you. Thank you so much, both Deepta, Deepa, and all those who attended this session.
and
See
I
you.
should thank you too. Really,
Thank,
yeah.
thank you.
Especially Deepta for all the really
Yes.
the going
What
through the
wonderful
material.
films.
Yeah, yeah,
But still, feel such hope.
yeah. I just want to tell everybody we also have a website and it's called
Mm-hmm.
Yugantar.film.
Okay.
And if you go to the website, there's a lot of material there. Not just about the films, but there are conversations between Nicole and me. There's a whole section on the restoration. It's a really it's a really interesting website. So if you're interested, please take a look.
Sure.
Yugantar.film. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone. Good
Thank
night.
Good
you.
good night, and thank
Thank
you.
you all for your time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye.
Absolutely.
Good night.
Good
Thank you
night.
all
Yeah.
for your patience.